Well, there you are. Come on in now. Pull that blanket up and settle in. Get yourself comfortable now. There's no rush. It's a good night to just be still for a while. The world's still out there doing whatever it does. But that's got nothing to do with you right now. You've done enough today. More than enough, I'd wager. So let's just sit together a spell and let the evening do its thing. Got a cup of something warm here? Not sure I'd even tell you what it is. Something my daughter left. She worries about me drinking coffee at night. She's probably right about that. There's a bit of a chill coming under the door tonight. That old kind of chill. The kind that makes you glad to be inside. Makes you glad to be sitting still. It's a good night for a story, I think. A good night for a long one. Rip Van Winkle. Now, I want to tell you a story tonight, an old one that I first read when I was I couldn't have been more than 12 years old, sitting in my grandfather's house, actually, which seems appropriate. It's a story by a man named Washington Irving, and if you've never heard of Washington Irving, well, he was one of the first great American writers. Back in the early 1800s, when this country was still very young and very much figuring out what it was, Irving had a gift for taking a place, a real place, and making it feel like it had always been a little bit enchanted, like the magic was already there, waiting to be noticed. And the place in this story is the Catskill Mountains. Now, if you've ever seen the Catskills, and I do hope you have, you'll understand immediately why Irving chose them. They rise up out of the Hudson Valley in New York State like something out of a painting. Big, old, rounded mountains, the kind that look like they've been sleeping for a very long time. On certain days, especially in autumn, the clouds sit right down in the valleys between them, and the whole range seems to float. Irving called them fairy mountains, and he wasn't wrong. This story is called Rip Van Winkle, and it takes place in a little Dutch village nestled right at the foot of those mountains, long, long ago, back when the Dutch had settled that part of New York and built their little farms and their little houses and their little lives. Now the Dutch, and I say this with great affection, had a particular talent for being comfortable, for building a good life and then sitting in it very contentedly. Good food, good pipes, good neighbors who didn't ask too many questions. Irving was half Dutch himself, and I think he understood their particular genius for the pleasant and the unhurried. Anyway, the story. In this little Dutch village at the foot of the Catskills, there lived a man by the name of Rip Van Winkle. And Rip was a particular kind of man. He was the kind of man that everybody liked. That's the first thing you need to know. Children adored him. He'd spend whole afternoons teaching the village boys to fly kites or showing them how to catch fish in the creek with nothing but a bent pin and a piece of string. He'd help any neighbor who asked, didn't matter what the task was, didn't matter how long it took. If your fence needed mending or your roof needed patching, Rip Van Winkle was your man. His dog Wolf loved him completely, and a dog's judgment, in my experience, is about as reliable as anything you'll find. There was only one person in the entire world who did not find Rip Van Winkle entirely delightful, and that was his wife, Dame Van Winkle. Now, I don't want you to think too harshly of Dame Van Winkle. I don't think Irving intended that either. The fact was, and you'll have to take this on good authority, Rip was not exactly what you'd call industrious when it came to his own affairs. His farm was a mess. The fences were always down. The weeds had long since given up any pretense of competition with the vegetables and simply taken over entirely. The roof leaked in two places that Rip had been meaning to fix for several years. He could spend the whole day helping a neighbor plow 40 acres, and then come home and not notice that his own cow had wandered into the cornfield again. And so Dame Van Winkle talked about it, at length, with feeling. Rip's response to this, and I think there is a certain philosophical wisdom in it, though I'd not say so to his wife, was to take his gun and his dog Wolf and go up into the mountains. And that brings us to the Catskills. I want to slow down here a moment because Irving spends some time on these mountains, and I think he was right to. They're worth describing. The Catskills rise up behind the village like a great sleeping wall. In summer, they're thick and green and full of shadow, the kind of forest where the light comes through in long angled shafts, and everything smells of moss and cold water. In autumn, in autumn the whole range catches fire, red and gold and orange from one end to the other, so bright on a clear day that you almost have to look away. And at certain times of year, usually in the late afternoon when the light is going golden and the mist starts rising out of the valleys, the mountains do something peculiar. They seem to deepen, to become more themselves, like they're settling in for the night and deciding not to be entirely of this world anymore. Irving wrote that on quiet days the villagers used to hear long rolling sounds coming from the mountains, like distant thunder, he said, except the sky was perfectly clear. Some said it was a Dutch navigator named Hendrik Hudson and his crew, playing at ninepins up in some rocky hollow, playing their game, rolling their great stone balls down the mountain, the sound of it rolling and rolling until it faded away. Now, whether you believe that or not is entirely your own business. Rip believed it, or at least he was the kind of man who would. One long autumn afternoon, Rip Van Winkle took his gun and called for Wolf and went up into the Catskills. He'd been squirrel hunting, he thought, and had gotten a little turned around, as one does on a mountain where the trees are tall and the paths disappear when you're not looking at them. He climbed higher than he'd intended, following the sound of a little waterfall, then following the sound of the wind in the pines, then following really nothing at all except the feeling that there was something interesting just a little further on. Wolf padded along beside him, stopping now and then to look up at his master with an expression that, in a dog, might have been concern, or might have been curiosity. With Wolf it was sometimes hard to tell. The afternoon light was getting long and golden. The shadows between the trees were getting deep. Rip had climbed to a high, narrow hollow he'd never found before, a rocky little amphitheater of sorts, open to the sky above, the mountains rising steeply on three sides, and below him the whole valley spread out in the haze of late afternoon. He could just make out the glint of the Hudson River far away and the little smudge of smoke that was his village. He sat down on a rock to rest and watch the sun go down, and it was then that he heard his name, Rip Van Winkle. Just that, his name, called out across the hollow in a strange, deep voice. Rip looked around. Wolf growled low and pressed against his leg. Coming up through the rocks below him was a short, square, odd-looking figure of a man, carrying a great wooden keg on his shoulder and struggling considerably with the effort of it. He was dressed in the old Dutch fashion, knee breeches, a wide belt, a great round hat, clothes that looked as though they'd last been fashionable some considerable time ago. His face was broad and weathered, his beard long and white, and he looked at Rip with small dark eyes that were somehow both ancient and entirely lively. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the keg and then looked at Rip. Rip, being Rip, came down from his rock and helped the man carry it. They made their way together deeper into the hollow, through a narrow pass in the rocks, until they came out into a wide, flat place that Rip was certain had not been there a moment before. And in that flat place other figures were gathered. There were perhaps a dozen of them, all in the same old Dutch dress, all with the same broad weathered faces, all with beards of varying lengths and shades of gray. They were utterly silent, not the silence of men who have nothing to say, but the deeper silence of men who have not needed to speak for a very long time. They were playing ninepins, rolling heavy stone balls across the flat rock toward 9 stone pins set at the far end. And every time the ball rolled and the pins scattered, there came that low, long sound like thunder, rolling out through the mountains and away. Rip watched all of this and felt not exactly afraid. He was not really made for fear, Rip Van Winkle. He felt instead a sort of heavy wonder, the kind that sits on you gently and makes your legs feel like they belong to someone else. The first man set down the keg. Another of the silent figures drew out the stopper and filled a large flagon, which was passed to Rip. Rip looked at it. He looked at the silent men. He sniffed it, and it smelled of something dark and sweet and old. He drank. It was very good. He drank some more. The figures went back to their game. The thunder rolled across the mountains. The light in the hollow, which had been golden, was becoming something else, something softer and more indefinite, the kind of light that happens just after the sun has gone, but before the stars have quite arrived. Rip drank again. His eyes were getting heavy. The sound of the stone balls on the rock was very regular, very even. He set down the flagon. He lay back on the flat, cool rock. He closed his eyes, and he slept. Now, this is where the story does something extraordinary, something that I've always found rather beautiful in a melancholy sort of way. Rip Van Winkle slept, and slept, and slept. The seasons turned on the mountains above him. The leaves came and went. Snow fell on the hollow and melted. The deer moved through and were gone. The hawks circled and the storms rolled in off the Hudson, and the old stone mountains stood exactly as they always had, keeping their own time, which has nothing much to do with ours. 20 years passed, 20 years in which the world turned and changed and filled itself up with new things and lost some old ones. And Rip Van Winkle slept through all of it, peacefully, undisturbed, with the great mountain silence around him like a blanket. You know, I have always thought that there are worse ways to spend 20 years than in a deep and dreamless sleep on the side of a mountain. But then, I am not the one with a farm falling to pieces. Anyway, when Rip Van Winkle opened his eyes, it was morning. He lay on the flat rock in the hollow, the sky above him pale and new, birds moving through the trees in that purposeful way they have just after sunrise. His gun was beside him, but it was rusted, and the stock had rotted through. Of the strange figures there was not a sign. Of the stone pins and the rolling balls, nothing. His joints ached considerably as he sat up. He was stiff in ways he hadn't been the day before. His beard when he reached up to scratch his chin, seemed to have gotten rather longer than he remembered, rather significantly longer. He stood up slowly and looked down at himself and looked at the rusty gun and looked around the empty hollow. "Well," said Rip Van Winkle. He started down the mountain. It took him a good while longer than it should have. His legs were not entirely reliable. He had to stop twice to rest, sitting on fallen logs and looking at his hands, which seemed to him somehow unfamiliar. The forest felt the same old trees, the same cold creeks, the same patches of mountain laurel, and yet something about it was different. He couldn't quite say what. The village, when he finally came down into the valley, looked different too. More of it, for one thing. Houses where he was fairly certain there had been fields. A new mill down by the creek. The road through the center of things was wider, better worn. And the people were entirely strange to him. Every face he passed was a face he didn't know. Rip stopped a group of children and asked where he was. They told him he was home. This was the village. He told them his name. They stared at him. He made his way through town to the inn where he used to spend his evenings. The inn was there, or rather, an inn was there, though it seemed bigger than he remembered and had a different sign above the door. Where the old portrait of King George had hung in the window, plump and placid King George in his red coat, there was now a portrait of someone else entirely. A tall, serious-looking man with a long face and a calm kind of authority about him. Someone Rip had never seen before. There was a crowd gathered outside, which was not unusual. People gathered outside the inn most evenings. But these people were talking about things Rip didn't understand. Congress and elections and the rights of citizens and a war that had apparently been fought and won. A revolution, they were saying. A whole new country. Rip stood at the edge of the crowd for a long time. A very long time. Then he went inside and asked for a drink of water and told the innkeeper his name and said he was looking for his neighbors and named them. Nicholas Vedder, who used to sit outside the inn on summer evenings and smoke his pipe with great contentment. Brom Dutcher, who was always ready with a good argument about nothing in particular. Van Bummel, the schoolmaster. The innkeeper looked at him carefully. Nicholas Vedder was dead. 18 years ago now. There was a wooden marker on his grave. Brom Dutcher had gone off to the war and never come back. Van Bummel had become a colonel and then a congressman and was said to be doing very well in the city. Rip Van Winkle sat down on a bench. He sat there for quite a while. He asked very quietly about his wife. There was a pause. The innkeeper looked at the ceiling for a moment. Dame Van Winkle, he said, had passed some years ago. Not long after her husband had disappeared, in fact, had worked herself into a great agitation about it all, and well, she had passed. Now I won't tell you exactly how Rip took this news, because Irving is a little delicate about it too, and I think that's right. It is a complicated thing to be told that the person you lived with, the person whose voice you heard every day of your life, even if it was mostly telling you what you'd done wrong, is gone. Even if life was difficult with that person, even if the mornings are quieter without them, it's complicated. But then a woman pushed through the crowd, a young woman with a baby on her hip, come to see what the fuss was about. And she looked at the old man with the long beard, and the old man looked at her, and something passed between them. Her name was Judith. She was his daughter. She had been a girl when he left. She was a woman now, with a child of her own, and a husband who was sitting quietly at the edge of the crowd, looking at his father-in-law with a pleasantly uncomplicated expression. And then came pushing through from the other direction a ragged young man, idle-looking, easy-smiling, the kind of young man who is always ready to help a neighbor and not quite so ready to get to his own affairs, the kind of young man who could spend the whole afternoon flying a kite. His name was Rip Van Winkle the younger. He was the spitting image of his father. And Rip Van Winkle, the original Rip Van Winkle, old Rip with the long white beard and the rusted gun, sat in the sun outside the inn and looked at his daughter and his grandson and the new country he'd come back to, and he felt something start to come loose in him, some tight thing that had been wound up for a very long time. He stayed. Where else would he go? The mountains were behind him, and the valley was in front of him, and his daughter made up a room for him in her house, and his grandson followed him everywhere with that uncomplicated devotion that small children and good dogs have always had for Rip Van Winkle. The village took to him quickly. He was a curiosity, certainly, the man who'd slept 20 years in the mountains. People came from neighboring towns to hear the story. He told it willingly enough, with various embellishments that grew gradually more elaborate as the years went by. The strange men in their old Dutch clothes, the thunder of the ninepins, the taste of the drink, like nothing he'd ever tasted before or since. The older people in the village would nod slowly when he described the figures. There were those who said they'd heard the thunder on certain evenings and knew well enough what it was. There were those who said Hendrik Hudson and his crew had never really left these mountains, that they came back every 20 years or so to play their game and keep watch over the river and the valley that Hudson himself had sailed up so long ago. Rip had no reason to doubt it. He was not, as I have said, a man built for skepticism. As for the farm, his son took over what was left of it, and made rather a better job of it than his father ever had, which is perhaps how it should be, each generation improving slightly on the one before, making up for the fences left down and the cows let into the corn. Rip didn't mind. He sat in the sun. He told his story. He watched his grandson grow. In the evenings, when the light was going golden and the mist was rising in the Catskills, he would sometimes sit very still and listen. And on certain evenings, when the air was clear and the valley was quiet, he thought he could hear it, far away and high up, the low, long, rolling sound like thunder. He would smile then, just a small smile, and he would go inside. You know, I've thought about this story a great deal over the years. It's one of those stories that seems simple on the surface and then turns out to have rooms in it you didn't expect. There's the obvious thing, the sleeping, the waking, the world changed while you weren't looking. There's something in that about how quickly it all goes, how you can be so thoroughly inside your own ordinary life, your own arguments and your own habits and your own particular way of avoiding the things you ought to be doing, and then look up and find that 20 years have passed, and the world has become something new, while you were busy not quite getting around to things. That part of the story makes some people melancholy. It makes me well. It makes me think about the mountains. The mountains don't mind. That's what I come back to. Rip slept 20 years, and the mountains were right there when he woke up, the same as they'd always been, the same old-growth forest, the same cold creeks, the same hollow where the strange men played their game, The mountains have been watching this whole business for a very long time. The Dutch settling and the Revolution, and the years passing, and the generations coming and going. And they are entirely unhurried about all of it. There's something in that which I find comforting. The things that are old and large and quiet, they tend to still be there when you need them. Mountains, rivers, the stars on a clear night. Stories like this one that have been traveling from one pair of hands to another for 200 years. Washington Irving wrote this story in 1819, more than 200 years ago. And here it is, tonight, in this room, in the quiet, still doing its work, still putting people to sleep in the best possible way. The wind down. And I suppose that's the thing about it, really. Some things don't need an ending. They just fade into the next quiet thing. The mountains are still there, right where they've always been. The night has a way of taking care of the rest. And I suppose that's the thing about it, really. Some things don't need an ending. They just fade into the next quiet thing. The mountains are still there, right where they've always been. The night has a way of taking care of the rest. Well, that's about all from me tonight. You just close your eyes now. Don't worry about what's coming tomorrow. It'll sort itself out, same as it always does. You did good today. Sweet dreams now. I'll be right here.